My area of expertise is governance and multilateralism, and I have a particular interest on the role of different types of knowledge, including science, in supporting intergovernmental processes and decision-making. So it's related to that theme that we gathered today as a side event to the UN STI Forum, which of course is fundamentally, the entire forum is interested in and related to the role of science and innovation in supporting more effective policymaking. And that is very much the focus of our discussion. I should say that, again, even if we end up being a fairly small group, I very much intend to share the key insights and lessons from this dialogue today with a wide range of representatives attending the STI Forum and with a large number of member state actors who I know are particularly interested in conversations about how to strengthen knowledge interfaces in order to support sustainable development. So just as a little bit of background context before I introduce our very eminent panel, this meeting is being convened by the University of Bristol on think tanks, which is a think tank group based in Latin America, and by 4 sub-Saharan African think tank partners who I'll introduce in turn in a minute. And we're a sort of a slightly strange consortium who came together from very different sectors and backgrounds and interests, because we all share a passion and a conviction of the importance of strengthening science and knowledge, different types of knowledge, within discussions about, within policy and decision-making at multiple different levels of governance. And the reason that this project was catalyzed is because under the leadership of one of our very esteemed panel members, Ambassador Kisaba Rossi, who was formerly the president of the UN General Assembly during the 77th session, there was a real focus on how to strengthen the role of science within the senior-most level of multilateral cooperation and diplomacy, that being the UN General Assembly. And so we brought this group of knowledge actors together to try and think about different insights from different scales of government and policy making, and how those insights might contribute to a dialogue about how to strengthen science in the context of the UN General Assembly. But of course, it's an incredibly difficult topic and an incredibly difficult task, because there are so many debates about almost every stage of the evidence to policy process. Questions are definitional, like what kinds of evidence count. They're institutional, like what kinds of mechanisms work, and they're scalar. So how do we take knowledge from local levels, national levels, and feed that into the international realm? And all of those themes, I think, will come out in our discussion today. So we have brought together this wonderful panel today to speak with you all. And after my introduction, I promise to try and keep my interventions to a minimum and let them all speak. So just by way of quick introduction, we have on the line Ambassador Kisaba Rossi, who was former president of the UN General Assembly during its 77th session. He is from Hungary and was formerly the permanent representative of Hungary to the United Nations. And amongst many other distinguished positions, he served as strategic director of the Blue Planet Foundation, a distinguished fellow of the Agato Sadako Research Institute for Peace and Development underneath JICA, the Japanese Development Agency. And he's a member of the International Advisory Board to COP29, as well as the forthcoming World Science Forum in November of this year. So as you can see, just purely from his resume, Ambassador Rossi is very committed to strengthening science within different policy processes. We're also joined by the Chief Executive Officer of the International Science Council, Dr. Salvatore Arricco, who has worked for over 30 years at the interface of science and policymaking, including serving as the head of ocean science at the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, as Executive Secretary of the United Nations Secretary General Science Advisory Board, Senior Visiting Research Fellow at the United Nations University, and many other positions. Sitting as the Chief Executive Officer of the International Science Council, Dr. Arricco has a particularly unique position in trying to bring together very diverse knowledge actors from around the world and convey their inputs to different political processes, including the United Nations. So we look forward to hearing your insights. We're also joined by Dr. Frejus Thoto, who's the Executive Director of ASED Benin. Burgess works across a wide range of sectors, but has particular expertise in food and nutrition security in Benin in the West African region. ASED is a fabulous organization, a think tank organization that we've worked with closely for the last year and have really benefited from their knowledge and expertise of policymaking processes and practices in the West African region, and specifically in Benin, related to food and agriculture. But he's also worked in many different organizations, such as the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations and the European Union's Technical Centre for Agricultural and Rural Cooperation, amongst other things. Also on the line are two more distinguished panel members. I'm going to go as quickly as I can through their eminent CVs, and then we will commence. We have Ivor Chipkin, who's the co-founder and director of the New South Institute. Ivor is another collaborator we've been working with over the past year because of his particular expertise and knowledge of South African governance and the fundamental role he's played, particularly in looking at issues of kind of state capture, but also issues related to the functioning and effectiveness of the civil service in particularly Southern African countries. He was the founder and director of the Public Affairs Research Institute at the University of Witwatersrand and the University of Cape Town before that. So is a sort of applied academic, I think might be a good way of describing you. And then finally, we have Ashan Ramlat Ali, who's a seasoned research management professional with a very diverse portfolio of projects, but with particular expertise in governance and humanitarian response. And who has worked with us over the last year, particularly on a case study in South Sudan, looking at how evidence has been used in the budgetary management processes in South Sudan. But Atan has a wide range of other skills and experience, for example, working with organizations like the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. And she is the co-founder of Samahi Research, who are one of our research partners. So that is our wonderful panel. Thank you so much for joining us, to all of you, and for being part of this discussion. I also just want to recognize before we start our co-hosts and partners on think tanks. You can see Marcella on the line. Marcella, give us a wave. And Marcella and her colleagues on think tanks have been our co-hosts of this event and have been fundamental partners in supporting this coalition over the last year. So I'm going to jump straight in, and I wanted to start by asking each of our panelists a specific question and giving you a few minutes or so to respond. And then we'll do a couple of rounds of dialogue and hearing your inputs before we open it up to our audience. As we go through our discussion, I'd like to invite audience members to put comments or questions or remarks in the chat, which is at the bottom of your screens. You should all be able to type any comments or questions you have in there. And those comments and questions will be recorded so we can take note of them for our subsequent meeting notes. Okay, so we'll start with our first question for Ambassador Karosi. And I think we're going to start at the kind of quite macro international scale. And I'd love to hear from you, based on your own extensive experience, Ambassador Karosi, what role you think science is currently given in intergovernmental negotiation and intergovernmental dialogue, particularly within the United Nations and the General Assembly, which you know so well.
Jessica, thank you much indeed. To my best judgment and knowledge, not sufficient yet. Though by now, almost all intergovernmental negotiations include some kind of stock-taking phase, which is absolutely good. It was not necessarily the case 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Now it is almost inevitable. Particularly that the IPCC has made history and introduced a huge difference in our joint thinking and joint behavior by presenting reality, outlook, options, and consequences, all based on scientific evidence and methodology. And I think it had an influence on the better understanding the interdependence of processes and the nature of systemic challenges we are facing. But I would like to offer to you 4 missing links, in my understanding, in the intergovernmental negotiations and GA processes, and maybe 2 remarks. First, in the General Assembly, the depth and comprehensiveness of preparing the scientific evidence base is sometimes there, sometimes it is still a little bit missing, but largely depends on the co-facilitators and co-chairs. So it's rather personal. There is no institutional or rule-based guarantee for devoting sufficient time and creation of a science-advised shared knowledge base. The second missing link and the caveat is that even if we put together a kind of shared knowledge base, it might be still spontaneous to what extent the established shared knowledge base could contribute to the actual shaping of political debates at later stages of negotiations. Unfortunately, I saw all kinds of practices. The third missing link, if you wish, that if we have the basic knowledge shared, even if we use them for the negotiations, there is still no automatic scientific reality check of the outcome of the negotiations. We know the nature of the drafting exercises. Drafting is about making compromises among political mandates, but political mandates do not always consider scientific evidence. So the outcome of negotiations may be relevant or maybe less relevant in terms of having real impact on what we want to achieve. And my fourth observation, the missing link, if you wish, that the science-based validation of the implementation of our deals is completely missing in the intergovernmental processes. Unfortunately, it is more or less missing in the whole UN system as well. It is particularly striking in the case of sustainability transformation, where in the best case, we got pictures on some kind of implementation of standalone chapters. Though none of these chapters were designed to be standalone. It is their joint impact that makes real difference. And last but not least, two observations. To stay relevant, the intergovernmental negotiations, we are supposed to find solutions to existing and upcoming challenges. But if you listen to the negotiations, most of the time is devoted to the problems of the past. Even if some of the grievances, some of the problems are well-founded and well-understandable, we may iron out political answers, political compromises for the past. Science can be helpful, but cannot change the past. Future can still be altered through applying scientific knowledge and methodology. And my last observation would be that in the intergovernmental negotiations, we deal with complex processes requiring evidence-based multilateral cooperation. But we very often replace this cooperation by geopolitical camp building. This method is convenient, simple, but the result could very easily be a lose-lose game. So we should separate as much as possible the geopolitical camp building from the management of the global communities. That's my first meeting.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Kurosi. There's so much in there I think we could dig into in more detail. Can I just ask as a quick clarification on your last point? You said that we need to separate the sort of scientific dialogue from the geopolitical, I think you said camp building. And by that, you mean the kind of factionalism of the dialogues within the multilateral space. Is that what you mean? Oh, sorry, we're not hearing you right now. 1 second.
Sorry, I was muted. Uh, yes, indeed. In the multilateral sphere, you see more and more tendencies of building opposing camps and geopolitical camps. And when this spirit is prevailing, then the attention is less and less given to some real evidence on the ground, scientific evidence on the ground, but attention is going to the interest of the geopolitical grouping, which is overriding some of the absolute necessities. For example, in the climate negotiations, it is a striking example.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you so much. I think this is a point I hope we can return back to, is kind of what kind of mechanisms and interfaces can help to some degree to mitigate some of that kind of politicization of these discussions that need to be evidentiary in nature and informed by kind of a wide range of knowledge inputs. So I hope we'll return to that point. I'd like to turn to Salvatore now to ask you to reflect maybe for a few minutes about the kinds of different mechanisms and interfaces that you've seen through your extensive career and in your role at the ISC that have been used to try and curate science and other forms of evidence, specifically within the UN. And have you found that they work? Maybe you can give us some sort of practical examples of what you think's been effective to date and what's been a bit more limited. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Jessica, and once again, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to suggest that we take a step back in history, and let me refer to the Montreal Protocol process, which, of course, everyone is aware of, but I think it's worth recalling it and referring to it as a great success of how a first ever assessment on ozone depletion eventually led to a fully fledged protocol developed, agreed on, and signed and ratified in a record time, with alternative technologies being to the chlorofluorocarbons, which were responsible for the problem, being deployed against a multi-billion fund put together very quickly. Now, that remains a rather unique example because at the end of the day, one of the reasons of the great success of the Montreal Protocol is that all the ingredients were united. I mean, alternative technologies were available. There was a market for such alternative technologies. So, switching from CFCs to other substances was kind of easy. The world was simpler. Climate change was, of course, dealt with already, but purely in the scientific sphere. And that model was replicated later with the IPCC itself, established at the end of the 80s, so a couple of years after the Montreal, the assessment on ozone depletion, and that model, the IPCC model, was elaborated and led to the great success that we all know. The first assessment report in '91 saying, well, it seems climate change is happening. The second report a couple of years later saying climate change is definitely happening. The third report and humans might have a role. The third report confirming that indeed there was a human-induced component, etc. Now, I think there was an interesting experiment that many people refer to, which is an assessment on agricultural science and technology, the International Assessment on Agricultural Science and Technology for Development, which was, I think, a bit of an experiment, very interesting, because once again, it built on the IPCC model. As a matter of fact, it was proposed, designed, and coordinated by Sir Robert Watson, who had chaired 3 assessment reports. But this time, so multi-agency effort with UNDP looking after the development side of agricultural science and technology, UNESCO, the science and technology dimension, UNEP, the environmental one, WHO, the health dimension, the World Bank, obviously. But the novelty was that it was coordinated by a multi-stakeholder bureau. Which means that for the first time around the table, you had, in addition, obviously, to the scientists themselves and UN organizations, stakeholders other than the scientists and UN organizations, namely the private sector, representatives of indigenous and local communities. It was a very interesting example. So, and this particular exercise happened to coincide after 4 years of work with the World Food Crisis 27-28, and which was, of course, a terrible moment, because almost 100 million people went back to extreme poverty overnight. But this assessment demonstrated, really by coincidence, that the reason why almost 100 people went back to poverty overnight had nothing to do with agricultural production. It was because food commodities were being speculated. There was a speculation related to food commodities in the world markets. And then if we go ahead in time, I hope I can take 1 or 2 more minutes. The IPBES, the so-called biodiversity equivalent of the IPCC, in reality, it goes beyond the functions that the IPCC discharges, because the IPCC only assesses current knowledge, but the IPBES also deals with capacity building, indigenous and local knowledge, but at that stage, the multi-stakeholder nature of the exercise got lost because obviously member states wanted to really be in charge. And as much as I should say that member states have always respected the freedom and the independence of science, the science behind those assessments, including when it comes to the summary for decision makers, at the end of the day, they don't vet the contents of those summaries. They just say what they are ready to respond to. Still, it was clear that being those intergovernmental processes, they very much wanted to stay, be in charge. So I think nowadays that model has encountered, shows clear limitations. And at the international level, there have been some more recent efforts. Some platforms have been put in place since the adoption of the SDGs, namely, including the I STI Forum, that we constitute a side event to, and the Global Sustainable Development Report. But those other platforms, including the GSDR, focus mostly on the policy for science issues and the evolution of science systems, but do not really provide actionable insights on how science can assist in the operationalization of transformations for sustainability. So just to wrap up, I think there is a need for new models, and perhaps if, because I don't want to monopolize the word, if there is a chance to refer to some of those new models a bit later during our conversation, I'm happy to come back to it. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. That was a really comprehensive overview. So thank you so much for giving us that institutional landscaping, if you will, and flagging, not only the IPCC, which I think is so well known to everyone, but other important moments, relating to agriculture and biodiversity and so on, which I think offers some really interesting learning. We have thus far focused very much at this sort of sky-high view of what are the different processes that we use within the sort of highest, most level of intergovernmental cooperation. And this is, really, obviously a strong focus of our work in this discussion today. But one of the things that we were really interested to dig into when we did our project over the last year with colleagues in different think tanks in African countries, was to better understand whether these international dialogues and discussions about how you use science and how you create platforms for science actually reflect national realities, and whether this whole dialogue about how science is being used to support national decision-making is actually being mirrored at the national and local scale, or is actually just taking a completely different tack. And so I'd love to turn now to Frejus, who's joining us, as I said, from ASED, based in Benin, to ask you, Frejus, do you think that these international processes really reflect national realities? And do you, in your work, have you seen that science is routinely used to support national decision-making or not? And perhaps you could give us some examples to illustrate that. Thank you. Frejus.
Thank you very much, Jess, and thanks to the other two colleagues who have taken us through the international processes. I will focus more on what we can learn from the national processes. I've been personally working and collaborating with national decision makers for many years now. And I can confidently say that I'm not quite sure if science is routinely, I want to focus more on that word, routinely used to support national decision making. But one thing that is quite evident is that decision makers are using different types of knowledge from various sources to make decisions. It could be information coming from journalists, it could be citizen evidence coming from public consultations, it could even be just simply an advice offered by researchers at university. But if we are really referring to evidence as a knowledge coming from a scientific methodology or a scientific process, then its use is quite low in our context. And when I say in our context, I mean the African context, with some focus on the West African context where our operations are more deployed. And evidence is not, I would say, the use of evidence is quite low for many reasons, but I want to come back on some of them. And one of those reasons is the relevance of the scientific knowledge that is produced. Relevance to the needs of the policy makers. We are in a context where as you clearly know, funding is coming mainly for research not from national sources, but more from international sources. And those funding that are fueling research production, they come with some interests, which are not always aligned with the national interest. You could see a very nice research on a specific topic, maybe on education or agriculture, but basically the topics that have been addressed are more of interest for the European or the American university with which the local university is collaborating, or is just of interest for the funder and not really to the interest of the policy maker. And when you are producing knowledge or evidence which is not very much aligned with the interests and needs of those who are supposed to use them, definitely the use will be very, very low. Another aspect that is also very important explaining that low use of evidence is the issue of format. When you are referring to scientific evidence, They are mostly presented in scientific papers and very often behind paywalls. We are working in mostly in Francophone African countries, but most of the good research that is produced in the region is produced in English. It can be very, very simple, but it's a very big impediment to the use of evidence where all policymakers, they are more Francophone, and the evidence that they have available is produced in English. It's already a big gap that should also be filled. The last point on why evidence is not that much used in our context is also that it's very insufficiently disaggregated for specific decision making. You will encounter research that can talk to the whole country, but policymakers sometimes they want very localized, very specific evidence to make informed decision making. The other point I also want to stress is that we need to be aware that decision making is an individual activity. It's an individual exercise. It's not a group exercise. So you will also come to the realization that you need decision makers to understand the added value of evidence-informed practices. And we've seen that in many contexts in the region, in Benin, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Togo, where just because the minister is aware of the importance of mainstreaming evidence into the policy-making process, it can decide maybe to assemble a group of researchers or experts to support the policy development process, even sometimes in the absence of formal rules that are requiring it. So in conclusion, just to be a bit brief, I think while the use of science in national decision-making may vary in different contexts, there is a clear need for improved relevance, improved accessibility, but also the need to understand how to bridge the gap between the scientific evidence that is produced and the policy and practice stakeholders that are supposed to use those kind of scientific knowledge. But the context in our region is moving very, very well and in the positive direction. We've been seeing very good signals that policymakers and practitioners are asking more evidence, more specific and localized knowledge that can support their decision making. So I'll stop there for now. I hope I can come back to some of the institutional processes later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rogers. That was really insightful and really great to hear firsthand of your experience working in different contexts across Africa. And actually, although the sort of international level and the national level sometimes feel quite distinct, I think I see a huge amount of parallels between what you were saying and former colleagues were saying, relating to kind of the evidence that we use, whatever source it comes from, being very problem and policy responsive. Saba was making the point about it being forward-looking and thinking about forecasting, which is not something we routinely do. The point about it being accessible, not behind paywalls, in the right languages, etc., which I think is a common issue. And also the fact that too often it's left at the discretion of individual policymakers, be that the co-chairs of an international process or whoever is the relevant bureaucrat who's overseeing a given policy process. And actually, we need more institutionalized processes to make sure that it happens, irrespective of the particular climate that we're in. So very helpful and very interesting. Thank you so much. I want to now turn to our colleague Ashan to just focus a little bit more on some of the political issues. So I think all of the speakers have already alluded to the fact that the uptake of science or alternative forms of knowledge is often quite dependent on the political context within which you're working, and the extent to which sometimes these processes can be politicized. And I wonder, based on your own work, particularly the work you've done in South Sudan, what impact you've seen that kind of political stability has on these processes. In a previously highly conflict-affected country like South Sudan, have you managed to make has there been much advancement in sort of advocating for better use of different forms of knowledge and evidence and science in policy processes? And how much do you think that political climate really impacts on the success of these kinds of things? We would love to hear from you and hear if you have any specific examples. So Ashan, over to you.
Thank you, Jess, and thank you, colleagues and all attendees. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. In the case of South Sudan and really conflict affected areas, the environment is very key, because if you don't have a stable environment, you cannot pretty much do anything. In South Sudan, for instance, we've had a case where money that is supposed to be allocated towards, say, priority needs will be diverted and allocated to more emergency needs such as security or humanitarian. And so money that should be going to evidence generation is really takes a back seat. So in this case, you have very limited resources and less focus on what would matter. Evidence generation is not a concern here. The other issue that I see, and in working in this environment, of course, is that you have a lot of interference in research, in your generation of scientific evidence, because the kind of research that you're trying to get information is not probably working out for the political actors, because there are different interests with for different actors. So it gets to a point where you're at loggerheads with the specific institutions. We have structures in place. We have very good institutions, but the implementation of it is very shaky, in the sense that you have the policy, but then on the other side, when it comes to following the policy is just there in theory. And so then you have to use the kind of the jungle law to try and implement, for lack of a better word, to try and get by, to work in such an environment. So what I'm trying to say is that environment is very important, because if you don't have that enabling environment, you can't thrive. You cannot even think about thinking of doing something constructive. In such a case, you have to be targeted in terms of the strategies that you approach whatever evidence generation you'd want to work on. And most times you'll find yourself having to partner with different stakeholders. Of course, you can't do studies without involving the government. This is the domain. But then you also find yourself having to work with different development partners and CSOs, for instance, to navigate some of the spaces that is there. So it's not a straightforward structure that we have, but you have to make do with what is there. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's in brief.
Thank you so much, Ashan, and for keeping your remarks family to time. I appreciate that. I think one of the things that you just highlighted, which is really interesting, is about kind of, as you said, maybe what we might call kind of interesting bedfellows. So when you're working in these difficult political climates, who do you have to partner with in order to make your knowledge and your research kind of politically palatable, and to get it through, and to try and foster an evidence-based dialogue, which I know that's something that Samahi Research has really tried to do, which is really interesting. And I think it leads us really well to our next speaker, who is Iva Chipkin. Iva has a really interesting role working in South Africa on issues of kind of statecraft and governance. And I know that you've found over your career that sometimes you've had to take slightly interesting tactics to maintain a meaningful dialogue on kind of evidence-based policymaking, and different approaches to how you communicate different forms of knowledge with different government actors. So I wonder if I could turn to you now to ask the question of what other determinants you think there are that dictate whether political actors use or take up scientific recommendations in particular. And also just your reflections on whether there's anything we can do to minimize the politics, if you will, which is the point Shaba was alluding to earlier. So Ivor, over to you.
So complicated questions, tough questions.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you for having me. Thank you for including me in this event. Very grateful to be here, and thank you to On Think Tanks as well for organizing it. I've been working on South Africa, as you mentioned, but I do think the South African case raises wider questions which might apply to many other parts of the world, if not to the international system per se, because its structure is particular. But in South Africa, at least for the last 30 years, and actually and before that as well, actually for most of the 20th century and until very, very recently, South Africa has largely had a one-party dominant political system. Whether it was the dominance of the National Party from 1948, and then after 1994, we've had the dominance of the African National Congress. And what this has meant, especially over the last 30 years, is that the policy environment exists in a context where party political contestation is alive and vigorous, but where there's very, very little prospect until now, potentially, of it affecting electoral outcomes. And what that means is that the government in power is fairly comfortable of remaining in power. And as a result, it is less open or less affected by ideas around how to improve its position in government, performance in government in a whole variety of fields, whether it's in health or in education or in science or any domain, because largely changes in those areas don't fundamentally affect its ability to remain in government. And I think that's a very important consideration in our context. Because South Africa, perhaps unlike other parts of the world, we have a very highly developed research environment in all sorts of areas. It's definitely not only based on research funded or supported by international donors. We have some outstanding universities. We have a very large research community. We have many, many research organizations doing, I think, in many cases, outstanding work in a whole variety of areas. And yet, what remains true in South Africa, as true as it is in Benin, in the way Prejudice has described it, is that very, very frequently, outstanding work seems to make very, very little difference to the policy environment. So we have a paradox, if you like. We have lots of high quality research. Sometimes, in many cases, it's been outstanding. And yet its ability to actually influence policy decisions in a whole number of fields has often been negligible. I've been working I tend to work in the field of public administration. And in that area as well, again, there's some very, very good work on the character of the South African government, which has for a long period of time put its finger on how the politicization of public administration in South Africa has presented a fundamental constraint on the performance of government. So we've known about these cluster of issues now for, well, funnily enough, since almost the beginning of the transition. There was a famous report from 1998, 4 years after the 4 years after the democratic election, that identified politicization as one of the key constraints on government. There's huge amounts of research to support those findings. It's in the public domain, lots of reports, lots of analysis, lots of seminars, lots of conferences. I've been involved in these sort of activities now for a long time as well, and yet no movement until now. And I think, and this is to go to your question, Jess, I think one of the decisive factors in the degree to which policy or evidence is taken up in policymaking circumstances relates to the political environment. And I think in our circumstances, it relates to the degree to which the research is relevant politically in electoral terms. In other words, whether the issue which is at stake becomes politically relevant to the ruling party. I think under those circumstances, there's a much higher chance that those sorts of issues become topics of vigorous debate, where evidence becomes a factor in considerations around them. So, for example, suddenly, because it looks like we're moving to a space of party contestation, where there's a likelihood there's a possibility of parties losing power, there's much greater interest in my particular area in the conditions of improving government performance, and suddenly government political parties and politicians are much more open to hearing about policies around what makes institutions perform better. So that's, I think, one of the big ones. Also, in the South African circumstances, there are two others, and they're all related, of course. It's when the courts have played a key role. So in the case, for example, of AIDS, South Africa went through a long period of AIDS denialism, again, in the face of overwhelming scientific evidence of the causality between the HIV virus and AIDS, and in the face of the government denial, the courts, especially the Constitutional Court, played a huge role in putting science and evidence on the political agenda. And again, vigorously contested, but nonetheless successfully ultimately. And then again, I think as well, civil society organizations, or what we call civil society organizations, advocacy organizations, the degree to which they take up those sorts of issues and whether they take up evidence-based research and make it part of their campaigns, I think can play a hugely important role. In the case of state capture, again, which I was involved in South Africa, what played a huge role in building the kind of alliances which ultimately defeated the Zuma government was civil society organizations placing this issue on the agenda and drawing on a large or an emerging body of research on the topic, demonstrating the causality between state capture and state failure. I think I've spoken enough.
Thank you, Ivor. And again, I think you've highlighted some really interesting, obviously national examples, but where I think there's, again, transferable lessons to dialogues in the international community, which is that often when there is a kind of a campaign or a sense of kind of public interest and awareness, there's a lot more political appetite. So I think, for example, based on my limited experience of when the SDG negotiations were going on, there was a very strong movement around the under-5 mortality targets. And that was really promoted, not only by evidence-based actors and people like The Lancet and sort of academic publications who were providing some of the more rigorous evidence of how that should happen, but also by large-scale campaigning organizations who were saying this is actually something that we and the electorate and people care about from a public health and well-being perspective, which sort of created that interesting coalition. So really interesting. Thank you so much, Ivor. I'm aware of everyone's talked a little bit longer than anticipated, but you've all had so many rich insights to share that I think that's been really worthwhile. I do want to go round all of our panelists again and just ask a couple of questions of you all. And then I would like to encourage anyone who's on the line, if you have any specific comments or questions that you want to ask of our wonderful panel members, please do feel free to put them in the chat or private message me, and I will direct them to colleagues. So I wanted to first sort of turn to Kshaba, Ambassador Karosi, and just ask you, based on what you've been hearing and kind of the different insights, admittedly from different scales of government, but what you think is interesting and transferable from what we've just heard, and what you think could be learnt from this huge mountain of knowledge that we have now about different science engagement processes and practices, about what could be used to try and catalyze action, particularly amongst the international community. And as we think about the SDG deadline in 5 years, how could science play a catalytic role in trying to galvanize progress?
Jessica, we are in trouble. If we look at the deadline that we put in front of ourselves, but you may remember 2030 was an artificial deadline, and we thought that not everything might be achieved by 2030, but at least the transformation itself might be ignited. But if we are very honest and ask ourselves a very simple question, and we debated it many, many times in our private conversation with the Secretary General Guterres, we convene the Sustainable Development Summit meeting, as we did last September. We ask world leaders to commit or recommit to the sustainability transformation, and halfway through on the implementation period, when our performance is standing at the level of 15% roughly, it might be a very serious question to be asked why the second half of the term would be more resultful than the first one. So what happened? Why your recommitment would be more relevant? There are many answers for that, but first and foremost, I think we need a science-based methodology of measuring sustainability transformation. We are still not able to give a very precise answer for a very simple question. Are we really making progress on the transformation itself? We may have more or less good knowledge on certain standalone parameters, standalone areas, but not the complex transformation. But we called it for in the, if I'm not mistaken, target 19 of the SDG 17, which called for the going beyond GDP. So what does it mean? We need standardized data, agreed science-based methodology, and a verification mechanism of implementation. This methodology, if you wish, should be flexible enough to support countries with various challenges and possibilities. And we've just heard, colleagues, that local specificities count. They are creating the realities for the life of communities. So the methodology must not be a rigid one, but to be flexible enough to be applied in various conditions. But still, it must be comparable and relevant to what we agreed upon. Mm-hmm. By the way, by going beyond GDP, we must create a planning tool to find the most efficient solutions through applying a systemic approach. It can take us to a new economics of sustainability, which is still rather missing, or we have only fractures of that. I think the many reports produced by the UN agencies should be viewed in the mirror of how relevant are they for the science-based sustainability transformation of the member states. Mm-hmm. And last but not least, we discussed it with Antonio Guterres quite a number of times. He decided to reconvene his scientific advisory board. And we agreed that this board should be able to support the GA negotiation processes as well. So it should not be a secret club of scientists, but be very relevant to start launching negotiation processes, to provide basic knowledge and provide a methodology of the verification of the results of the processes. So I think if we could do that, that would be a leapfrogging, and we would be much more efficient than we are today.
Thank you. That's really interesting, and it makes me think that we almost need to think about a way of articulating not these sector-based sort of measures of progress, but an approach that's much more focused on transformations. Sort of, these nexus issues like food and energy and circularity, and how do you take a sort of multi-sectoral approach to monitoring those different issues, and across, led by, of course, science and knowledge actors, but of course with meaningful member state dialogue. So very interesting, and I think I'd love to come back to this question of what should be the role of the Science Advisory Board moving forward, because I think they do clearly have a crucial role to play, and yet that hasn't really been talked about or amplified institutionally. So thank you so much. Really interesting observations, which I hope we'll come back to. I wanted to turn as well now, as someone, again, who works very much on the institutionalization of kind of science policy and process, to you, Salvatore, and ask, what do you think has the potential, much like Saba just said, what do you think has the potential to be really transformative in light of the impending deadline of 2030 and just our incredibly slow progress on the goals that we set ourselves in 2015? How do you think science could be elevated or used, or other forms of knowledge, to try and drive more catalytic action?
Thank you. Well, I have no magic solution, but I think likely the response is likely to come from the sum of a number of approaches which are being tested out and implemented. First of all, and this is also related to my answer, I can't resist responding to, or not responding, but reacting to the presentation by Ashan. You know, she rightly said in times of crisis, science and science advice is not really that important or that relevant. There are other issues which are more urgent. I mean, this is not to say that this is what she thinks. On the contrary, that was a provocation. Now, it is true in the experience of the International Science Council, science in times of crisis is often dealt with in terms of, for example, mirroring data repositories that can be destroyed in other countries, so that if something happens to data repositories in Ukraine, for example, well, at the end of the day, because they have been mirrored in the UK, those data will not be lost. But in fact, science advice is very important also in times of crisis, especially if we talk about science advice from the experts in political sciences, in sociology, in anthropology, from the social sciences constituency. But to come back to respond, address your question more directly, as Shaba said, the good thing is that evidence for policies is now recognized, or at least increasingly recognized, the need for. And but there is, as I anticipated, a need for new models. So, namely, there seems to be a strong need to build national science advisory systems if we are to institutionalize science advice, the provision of scientific inputs at the interface of science with policy, and that is increasingly, it is increasingly obvious that it's not only about translation, it's more and more about brokerage. It's about dialogues between scientists and policymakers. It's about what scientists know, what they don't know, what the implications of that knowledge is. And those institutionalized national mechanisms for science policy interactions and advice need to be accompanied by capabilities that need to be in place, that need to be, which will in turn feed relevant policy processes on a regular basis. So examples, I think one example is Rwanda. And I can cite the role of the Academy of Sciences of Rwanda, which is the Rwandan member of the International Science Council during the acute phase of COVID-19, the pandemic. The Academy was able to convene weekly expertise, expert advice to the government related to issues spanning from viral transmission or through education, but also social welfare. That advice was efficient and was impactful and is recognized by the government as a success story. So such national advisory mechanisms, there are so many in place, but they are so different. They vary from country to country in terms of nature of the scientific input, the scale at which those mechanisms operate, the composition. In some countries, it's about one individual that operates as scientific advisor to a science advisor to the prime minister. In other countries, it's a different organization with colleges or advisors, etc. So it's important to study those mechanisms to see what has worked and what has not worked. And the International Science Council partnered with an organization called the International Network for Government Science Advice that analyzes those models, but also tries to build capacity at the country level. And if I have one more minute, even less, there is also a new initiative in terms of course, it's always existed, but now it's about science inputs to the ministry and ministers, in fact, of foreign affairs and diplomatic missions of many countries. It exists in countries like Japan. It has been existed for a long time, Oman, but now it appears that those initiatives, those actually science inputs to individual ministries are federating themselves, exchanging lessons, trying to understand what can work and in which context. At the international level, there are a couple of interesting new models. One is the recently formed group of friends on science for action, and which was really a creature of Ambassador Koroshi. It is facilitated by the ISC and UNESCO, and it's very interesting to me. It's the best of my knowledge, it's the first time ever. And it's really not about the evidence for policy making in terms of relevant knowledge, but knowledge, scientific knowledge that ought to be actionable. And I think, but finally, I wanted to say, we also need to realize that most of the time, scientists, to be a bit self-critical, they produce knowledge which is not necessarily that actionable. So, you know, what we are talking about is a call also to the active scientific community to really leave a bit the ivory tower and realize that science and scientists, yes, they have to continue operating in as free and independent as possible way, but they also have a responsibility vis-a-vis society. So I think this is a call for both policymakers but also the active scientists to really do science differently, with a focus on actionable knowledge that can support the sustainability agenda, based on the co-design of the research questions and the co-production knowledge by multiple stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you, Salvatore. And I think this is a nice segue. I want to come to Aishan and Frejus next to ask, given both of your intimate knowledge of working in different contexts across East and West Africa, I'd be interested to know, Salvatore just made the point that, and Shaba did before, that where there's a sort of strong institutional culture in different national contexts, and existing strong institutional practices to encourage and curate science advice as and when it's needed in a crisis, or, as was the case with COVID-19, or just to have, sort of standing committees, then that can be much more impactful in making sure that kind of science is inputted into delegations and in international processes because of the necessary transfer of knowledge and policy processes. So I'd be interested to know, first, maybe coming to you, Aishan, just from your experience of working in East Africa and Uganda and Kenya and South Sudan, what institutional processes do you think have really worked in trying to help embed technical science advice and knowledge actors in government? So any examples or insights you might have?
Thank you, Jess. If I use the example, say, of Uganda, if I start with Uganda,
Mm-hmm.
I think a strong institution, of course, some will contest that when I say a strong institution in Uganda, it's questionable, but a strong institution in the sense that you've had institutionalized systems over time, right? And you've had cases where you have these civil servants who worked for a very long time and they have the institutional memory. So in such cases, you have the people who carry out the propagating this the knowledge are the veterans in the civil service. Most times that is what I have seen. Even when you find cases where people flaunt the rules here and there, but you'll find one or two institutions that the structures are adhered to, are followed, because one or two persons somewhere are following the institutionalization process, are following the rules as it should. And to that end, to an extent, strong institutions work. In the case of South Sudan, if we speak about structures, it's hard because, of course, of this history of the country. And coming from the north and then the south, and then you had different regimes and different structures in place. It's very hard to talk about how the institutionalization of the structures here. Most times information is, I mean, the structures, the institutionalization is donor driven. And it's because, in the case of South Sudan, because of conflict, the demands of what's the context. It requires that you adhere to what the needs of the current context is. And so the donors will steer the way. This is what we're going to do. We're putting money into this, and this you have to follow this. So whether or not it's relevant is really it's a non-issue. It's just to say the least. You don't have much say. So I think different.
Oh, we just lost. I think we just lost you briefly.
Sorry, had you muted me? You muted me.
Not that I'm aware of. I think it was an accident. Please finish your final.
You muted yourself.
Oh, have I been muted? No. Okay, you can still hear me. Good. Atan, would you like to finish your final point? You're not hearing us.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. Sorry, if you want to continue your final point. Sorry, I don't know, we had a technical glitch there. My apologies.
I think I lost my line of thought.
Our apologies, but anyway, thank you. I think your point is really well taken about the fact that in contexts like Uganda, where there's been a long institutional tradition in the civil service and others of using knowledge and data in different policy processes, it can persist irrespective of what happens in the sort of short-term politics. But as you were saying, in South Sudan, of course, it's much more donor-driven and in crisis response. So there is an interesting question there about the extent to which there should be an obligation on donors in the international community to promote this kind of action, or whether actually that's sort of too externally imposed. And we need to just sort of recognize that in such contexts, there's only so far we can go in trying to promote this kind of practice. So interesting tension. Thank you so much. I wanted to turn to Freitas and ask Freitas again, you've worked, I mean, in a great number of countries, but based on your experience and your intimate knowledge of particularly, you know, agricultural policy development in different countries across West Africa, are there particular practices that you've observed that you think have been effective at sort of helping to mainstream, if you will, more evidence use in policy dialogues?
Yes, Jess, thank you very much for that. I think on the institutional processes, there are quite of we have a number of examples that we can share, and we've been observing how they are influencing the whole evidence-informed policy making context. And the first one I want to share is the need to have a strong formal institutional architecture in place. Some may say that it's still in theory, but it's always good to put something on paper which will be compulsory for stakeholders to follow. In Benin, for example, there is a formal requirement to conduct evaluation of past policy, strategies, and projects before developing new ones. And it's quite new. I think it started in around 2014. Before that, it was not it was not compulsory for the Ministry of Planning or any development agency to conduct the evaluation of past policies before developing new ones. But now there is a whole guide supporting the policy development process. And one of the key steps is the development of evaluation of past policies. And this has brought the different stakeholders involved in the development of policies to conduct a number of research and to conduct evaluation that have the potential to generate some kind of evidence for the whole process of developing the plans. I can remember that back in 2009, when we were developing in Benin the National Agricultural Development Strategy, the strategy was basically developed in one office of the Ministry of Agriculture. You see one or two technical officers sitting and developing a whole strategy for a sector, just because there was no formal guidelines, formal rules governing the development of policies. The second point that is also important is related to the institutional frameworks. In some contexts, especially in many West African countries, universities, for example, they are under the Ministry of Higher Education, with no or little connection with the sectoral ministries. So you will come in a situation where the University of Agriculture, where most of the research, most of the evidence that is being produced on agriculture is happening, they have no, or they have very little relationship with the Ministry of Agriculture. And it's a missing link that is in the agricultural sector, for example. The university, even if they are under the Ministry of Higher Education, they will have formal pathways to work directly with the Ministry of Agriculture. Is something that would also help fueling the policy development process with evidence. And the last point that I want to mention, which is also related to the institutional processes, is the role of the intermediaries. Intermediaries, in terms of, we could also call them knowledge broker, but those intermediaries could be knowledge translation specialists, like ASSET, or they could even just be civil society organizations that have formal role in the policy development process, and they can be used as intermediary to bring evidence on the table of policy development. Because sometimes it's not always easy for an independent think tank to have the space in a policy development process. But with the progress that we've made in civil society organizations, some of them, especially those who are representing some stakeholders, they have a place already in the policy development space. And they can be used as intermediaries for evidence, for increasing evidence use in policy making. But for this to happen, they need to be embedded into the formal institutional architecture in the country. So, in a nutshell, creating strong formal institutional architecture and establishing very good conducive institutional frameworks. And I would even say partnerships would help a lot in connecting the evidence producers space to the evidence users, especially policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Frédéric, and also for those very practical sort of suggestions. I think on your last point, well, your second to last point, which was about the links to universities, that's something I wanted to come back to Ivor on, which is that, you know, in a context where you've been working on a couple of specific issues related to sort of the functioning of the civil service and public sector for a long time now, and you've seen kind of political interests peak and wane. What has been the role of, you know, the universities and the relationships between the governing parties and the universities in trying to kind of keep that dialogue alive and keep a conversation anchored in evidence and knowledge in government, even throughout political change? So I'd just be interested in your thoughts on the role of knowledge actors outside of government through different political time periods. Ivor?
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, I think the question is strongly related to the degree to which the broader environments are institutionalized or not. I think others have spoken about that, and the degree to which therefore formal organizations play a specific role at a specific time, and then the questions and the kinds of brokerage which is required to facilitate those relationships. So, for example, South Africa has a whole range of science councils which play a role in developing of policy in certain areas. The government has a whole range of dedicated government departments which play a role in developing policy in certain areas. And in that kind of architecture, universities therefore play a key role as providing researchers and analysis. And South Africa has all those elements of that kind of formal structure, which operates. And yet, overriding that structure is a kind of informal structure, where the relationships are much more ad hoc and are certainly personal. So the work that seems to have mattered over the last 30 years in South Africa is not so much the work coming out of formal institutions, which are able to then make a case for particular policies within the government environment. It's often depending on these sort of individual researchers having an impact on particular networks of decision makers within the ruling party or in such environments. So in those circumstances, I think what we're talking about is a highly deinstitutionalized or uninstitutionalized environment, and that produces different kinds of networks. I would say, just as an overriding factor, which I think is which is true at the national level as it would be at the international level. And I think there's lots of work which can be done in this regard. I think the question of the authority of the researchers, or the authority of not just of the research, but of who's doing the research is a huge factor. So the prestige, their sense of gravitas, their sense of whether these are people worthy of being listened to. What we've had is that even when outstanding work has been done, it's the sense that one can ignore those sorts of people that has played a huge role in discounting what's being said from them. So I think this question of the authority and standing of researchers and scientists in our environments is of great importance.
Ivan, thank you so much. This has been such an interesting discussion. And as you've all been speaking, I've been trying to tease out some themes that I think maybe might be interesting and useful and relevant, both at the international level and the national level, and that perhaps might provide some insights back to the dialogues going on, at the General Assembly and with the group of Friends for Science Action. So I wanted to run you through those themes and then give each of our speakers a chance to just quickly give us a 1-minute response to that, or tell me if I've got it horribly wrong, and take your final remarks that way. So I think the first, thing that we've heard repeatedly, the first word we've heard repeatedly throughout this discussion has been about institutions and institutionalization, and the fact that although sometimes, institutions can be ignored and sometimes processes can be kind of made irrelevant, if there is a strong culture of using evidence in different dialogues and processes, it does tend to persist and sort of ride through political upheaval. So, I think the interesting example from Benin there about creating a new practice of always having to do a retrospective policy analysis before designing new policy is an interesting example of a sort of practice that could have quite profound institutional ramifications, I think, across a range of sectors. Likewise, in countries that have very strong institutional connections to their universities, we've seen, in previous UN negotiations, I think it's been interesting to observe that they've often brought chief science advisors with them to international dialogues, because there is that persistent relationship and that kind of understanding that these actors are central to different political dialogues. So very interesting. And I think the points that a number of you have made about the links to national universities, sometimes they have more or less prominence, but having those formalized linkages can be important. So that's my first point about institutionalization. I think the second point is, which is readily acknowledged in much of the literature in this field and discussion in this field, is that science is a very limited term. And what we're really talking about here is kind of multi-actor based knowledge from a wide range of different stakeholders, but also recognizing that you need different knowledge for different purposes. And if you're looking at kind of a multi-country study of biodiversity loss, you are probably going to need something that's been curated by an institution with the capacity to do a longitudinal study using quantitative data. So, you know, there are different types of knowledge for different purposes, and recognizing that. I think a third theme we've heard, which again is quite well known, is around knowledge accessibility. So information being made available to deliberators in the right languages, not being behind paywalls and so on. Relatedly, the sort of fourth point about knowledge applicability and policy relevance. And I think the point there that all too often we curate this sort of interesting knowledge, particularly in universities, but it might not respond to the political realities of the ground, or it might not respond to what a politician can sell back to their electorate, right? What they can take home and say, I've engaged in this dialogue in a New York process or Geneva or Addis Ababa, and the reason I've done that is X, Y, Z, and this is how it's relevant to you in your national context. So showing the real policy utility of research. I think a fifth point has been around partnership and recognizing the importance of these different knowledge brokers and actors, and how you generally always need an intermediary in order to convey technical knowledge to a political, you know, audience, someone who knows the insights and the connections. And I think, you know, groups like the International Science Council play that very interesting role in the international community, but often we see it happening more informally. You know, whether it's think tanks based in Washington or Addis or, you know, in different parts in Latin America, often there are these intermediaries who are not recognized and yet are pivotal. So do we need to do something to kind of call that out and recognize that? And then finally, I think a really interesting theme has been around accountability, and the fact that you can curate as much knowledge as you want and you can produce as much, you know, as many interesting insights as you want. But if you don't actually monitor whether that's being taken up and used and what actions have been taken as a result of that evidence, it can be a bit futile. So those are my sort of 6 themes I think have been emerging from this discussion. I'd love to do a quick 1-minute whip round, everyone, and just get your reactions. I wanted to start, maybe I can start with you, Ashan, in light of the fact that you were cut off abruptly last time. Did you want to jump in and share your initial reactions and final remarks?
In regards to evidence generation in our context, I think there's need for ownership. If there's no ownership, you know, if someone doesn't have a stake in something, then they will just do it for the sake of doing it, just for the formality of it. There's no interest, there's no investment, there's no, and so it just dies a natural death. It doesn't, you're not able to sustain it over time. So I think there's need for ownership. Like you said, you need to bring actionable evidence this is relevant to the context, not donor driven. Yeah. If it's donor driven, people just do it because we want the money of the donors. And when that donor goes, another donor comes. What is left behind is nothing to talk about. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's my takeaway.
That's a really important caveat, I think, to everything I've said before, and all the points we've been making throughout this discussion about fostering national ownership. Wonderful. So going back in, I think the last reverse, well, slightly confused my order now, but maybe I could turn to you next, Frejus, to see if you have reactions or comments.
Yes.
Hi.
I hope can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, no, just quickly, one last comment. I think we've been discussing a lot about cycle, but I very much want us to understand or to acknowledge that evidence is just one element in the overall policy-making cycle, and we should not also oversell it. It's not, and in many instances, it's not even the most important element for the policymaker. They have more, they have other constraints related to budget, for example, which is highly important for them, related to the individual beliefs as well, their political interests, and even time constraints. So scientific evidence come into that context of multiple constraints that the policymaker is facing And it's important for us as advocates of strong evidence use to also understand the whole ecosystem in which the policy making is taking place, and understand that while we are pushing for evidence use, we should also know what are the political interests of the policymakers we are working with, what is maybe the budget constraints that they are having, and try to find ways to play with the ecosystem and put the evidence at the right time and at the right place. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, another really insightful final comment there. And thank you for flagging those different constraints, which I think we all intuitively know, but often lose sight of. So that's really helpful. Thank you. The last few minutes, so we'll keep it really brief. Iva, can I pass to you for a final minute reflection?
Oh, I would just second what Frederick has said. I think that's very important and absolutely key. And I think otherwise I think I'll hand over.
Okay, thank you so much, Iva. Salvatore, can I come to you next?
Yes, thank you. I'll be very brief. First of all, I was very impressed, Jessica, with your summary, and they are all relevant points and very well organized. And I wanted to react on one in particular: informal, yes, but structured. And in particular, this brokerage role is very important, and we the ISC are very important, very happy to see that even the renewed scientific advisory board of the Secretary General is organized now in concentric circles, if you like, with the independent experts, the UN, the chief scientists of UN organizations, and this outer circle where you have the active scientific community. That's the only way to go. And I was very intrigued by the words by Ambassador Koroshi on linking the scientific advisory board with member states. That would really complete this sort of integrated approach to science advice. Thank you.
Thank you, Salvatore. Very nicely put and very concise, so much appreciated. Ambassador Koroshi, I'm going to give you the final minute, final remarks. So any reflections or reactions or just final points you'd like to leave us with?
Thank you much, Jessica. Reacting to your proposals and your summary, which I found marvelous, on the institutionalization. We are talking about how to organize the way science can advise society on policymaking. From both sides, it should be predictable, transparent, responsible, and relevant. Mm-hmm. If we can match those areas, then this two-way communication might be really successful. On the role of science you've raised, basically with this science, we are trying to provide knowledge management, data management, and the methodology, how to use the data and knowledge. And yet again, the knowledge applied should be very relevant to the actual time, the actual society, the actual political context, and the actual crises or challenge we are facing. On partnerships, and we are basically talking about the science policy interface, which has been discussed for so many years. From my own experience in this country as well, it's very important that the science community could find a language that is easily understandable for the political decision makers. If we talk the language of pure science, it will be sooner or later ignored by political decision makers. If it is translated into their knowledge, their language, their priorities, it starts making the impact. And finally, you mentioned the accent. Yes, I fully agree. It means that we have to pinpoint and address the priorities of the given community, of the given country, given society, and the given time. If we all those points can take into consideration what you have mentioned, I think this 1.5 hours was not lost.
A big task. Well, thank you so much to all of you for your excellent insights, and thanks to those who joined online.